Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to the Unscripted Watch Chronicler podcast. In today's episode, which is the 11th, I'd like to speak about something which came up recently on Time and Tide watches and raised a few interesting points. And this is the point that affordable Swiss watches are dead. And the basic premise of this is that major industry leaders have predicted the end of Swiss watches under about £2,500, including the entirety of the quartz sector. Now, the article which spawned the idea for this video is very well substantiated, and I've gone through and done some research of my own on the subject. And so today I'd like to speak about this. I'd like to speak about why one can look at the watch industry and say that quartz watches from the Swiss side of things at least are on the way out, why mechanical watches have a new position, and why perhaps all of this is a bit glib and doesn't actually encompass the full truth of what's going on. So all of that will appear in today's podcast, but before I begin, remember to like, share and subscribe if you're here on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud or on Spotify to be able to catch this podcast elsewhere, whether you're listening to it or watching it as a full video. Also head over to Watch Chronicler Instagram to get updates about new articles, podcasts, videos, and just a general view of the watch industry, and go over to watchchronicler.com to be able to read proper articles and full features which don't appear here on the YouTube channel or on the various channels for this podcast. This week's episode is sponsored by Orage, the maker of unique timepieces with their own in-house movement, truly made for those who relish detail, innovation and real-world value. Now the first part of this situation to speak about is the fact there is always fluctuation in everything, whether it's watches or anything else, and certainly the strength of the Chinese market and the Hong Kong markets has skewed things a little bit, because in recent years it's become an enormous market for watches. And whilst at the moment there's a reported slump in sales as a result of the situation over there at the moment, both political and medical, one can discount these fluctuations as just market changes because they do happen. But what I'd like to talk about more in this podcast is the fact that there have been much larger changes across the watch industry and the watch world, specifically relating to Swiss watches. And I think speaking about the facts, first of all, is important. And these figures have been taken from the Swiss watch industry FH between 2000 and 2019. I haven't included 2020 because, of course, we're at the beginning of the year. But speaking purely about the number of Swiss watches exported between 2000 and 2019, this has fallen from just below 30 million pieces to just above 20 million pieces. So the number of watches going out of Switzerland has dropped, which is worth considering. And so one does have to understand the fact that the way in which the Swiss are approaching the production and sales of watches has changed. Now there is also a break in value, and this is a break in value between quartz and mechanical watches. And I want to put this out there at the start of the podcast, because whilst looking at the fact that the number of watches produced and exported has dropped, one has to look at the break in value between quartz and mechanical watches. Now, in terms of the break in numbers of pieces produced, in 2000 one saw a break in numbers between quartz and mechanical watches of about 91.7% quartz and 8.3% mechanical. So a very significant swing there in terms of numbers towards quartz. And we see this in a number of interviews. For example, Hublot at the turn of the 21st century was producing well over 90% quartz watches. Now they're almost entirely mechanical. In 2019, however, this break was very different, with 65% quartz and 35% mechanical. And the change is even more noticeable if you look at the break in value, because we saw a change from 52% quartz to 48% mechanical. So, of course, there was a similar amount of money coming in from both, despite the fact there were far more quartz watches produced. But now it's all the more noticeable, with only 17% of Swiss watches being quartz, considering the fact that most people own quartz watches. This shows a very big swing towards new interest in mechanical watches, and inevitably a different price range. But looking at what industry experts have said so far, it does seem that there are two clear points being made. One being that quartz watches from Switzerland are receding and will disappear in the next few years. And the second is that the price range of Swiss watches is going to go up. It's been stated by leading industry members and long-standing industry members that Swiss watches below the £2,500 price range, give or take, will disappear in the next few years. So I'd like to address each of these individually. But first I'd like to speak about quartz, because quartz was this promised technology which would bring accuracy never before seen to the watch world in the 1970s, and continued to be viewed that way for some time. Certainly it's clear to notice that quartz watches today are the most accurate in the world, and quite frankly it would be impossible to produce a mechanical watch with the same sort of accuracy. It's just a different type of watchmaking, and one which isn't comparable. But looking at quartz watches specifically from Switzerland, in resistance to quartz watches, mechanical watches reached a state of prestige in the 80s and 90s, and in many ways carried the Swiss watch industry into the 21st century, when many regarded it as a dying industry, as one which couldn't keep up with the accuracy, with the quality, with the features of Japanese quartz movements. And Swiss approaches to quartz watches did exist, but never could face up to what was being delivered by Japan. And Swiss watches became synonymous with the prestige given to mechanical watches, particularly by Swiss brands in the 80s. So it became very much a fact that if you were buying a Swiss watch, you were buying something of superior quality. But then you get this interesting point, because in the early 2000s, quartz watches were very popular, Swiss-made quartz watches too, but in recent years they've become undesirable or even redundant because of smartwatches. And I remember when the Apple Watch was launched, people immediately jumped on the idea that it was going to kill all Swiss watches, whilst a lot of other people said it was operating in a very different market. But I think there's a sort of halfway house, because on the one hand you have luxury watches which serve a very different function to a smartwatch, but on the other hand you have a lot of quartz watches in the sub-£1,000 price range, which offer inevitably less functionality than a smartwatch, but compete with a similarly disposable outlook on things, because people don't assign value to them unless they're of personal value, because they're not worth as much as a luxury watch would be. Of course, there is also the other side to the quartz movement, which is that with synchronized time on our phones and laptops and computers in general, absolute and immense accuracy from a wristwatch is driven far more by vanity than necessity. The fact is, no one needs a chronometer because your phone and your computer is always going to be synchronized, and so as a result is not going to have the same internal need for accuracy, and so it doesn't really matter. But I hesitate to come down too hard on the quartz watch, because this view, which has been put forward and which I've tried to elaborate on, doesn't allow for the rise in fashion watches, something which I'll come to a little bit later. But first, a message from a sponsor. And the sponsor of this podcast is Orage, a brand with a unique outlook on design and quality, and with a remarkable new movement. Their 39mm Autark offers a sculpted titanium case which angles and curves inward to gracefully cover the wrist. Its dial, available with a power reserve, large date and small seconds, all native to the in-house movement, is beautifully finished. To contrast the remarkable hands and markers is a case available in hardened titanium to shrug off the most testing abuse. By contrast, their Omnium, with its facet-cut crystal and diamond-cut hands, is presented gleaming 904 stainless steel for added luster. This piece represents a modern interpretation of the principles of quality, widespread production and everyday practicality professed by the visionary Bauhaus school of design. All housing a highly developed in-house movement with a silicon escapement, Orage timepieces represent something truly new. Find out more at orage.com. But then we come to the second and potentially more interesting side of what's going on. The fact that the price of the average Swiss watch is predicted to rise significantly. And if we look at the progression of prices so far in the last 20 or so years, Swiss watches under 200 Swiss francs have collapsed almost entirely. It really has been an enormous collapse because, quite frankly, Swiss watches aren't produced at this price range anymore. And I'll come to reasons why, because I don't believe that it would be impossible to do so, but I think that in the current market they wouldn't do so. Similarly, Swiss watches under 500 Swiss francs have slowed down in terms of growth enormously. And even if you look at the average jeweler, the number of Swiss watches under 500 Swiss francs, or if you convert them into dollars or pounds or euros, you'll find that there are far fewer watches offered for that price than there were 5 or 10 years ago. The only market which has significantly increased is the 3,000 and above Swiss franc market. And this growth isn't skewed by inflation because the Swiss franc really hasn't suffered anything like the inflation the dollar or the pound have suffered in the last few years. In fact, there's been relatively minimal increase. If you look, for example, at a Swiss watch worth 3,000 francs in 2000, if you account for inflation, it's only about 32 or 3,300 Swiss francs now. So really not a huge amount of inflation, where the same amount in dollars would be about 4,500 now. So that's not skewed by inflation, but it's due to a number of different perspectives on the market. Now, certainly the perspective of a watch buyer has changed. The demand for brands which were previously looked at as technical watches for a function have now been marketed as luxury goods. I think Sinn, whilst not being Swiss, is a brand which uses Swiss components and is an interesting brand to look at, because a U1, for example, a highly technical dive watch, was £600 in the mid-2000s and now is almost 3 times that. So this kind of growth is because of a change in perspectives, a very clear change in perspectives. And because of these watches becoming luxurious, technical needs have risen, and so brands are trying to outdo each other, no matter how big or small they are, thus leading to higher prices. We see this with ceramic bezels, with new mechanisms and designs. And don't get me wrong, this has led to much better watches in many ways, but it has changed the price range in which they operate. Now, there still is one market in the affordable price segments which has grown significantly in the last few years, but which has remained virtually untapped by the Swiss industry. Rightly or wrongly, in fact, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But these are fashion watches, because fashion watches, which have done enormously well for brands like Michael Kors, for example, or Daniel Wellington, and whilst largely spurned by watch lovers, these are watches which offer simple timekeeping and good looks to people who aren't necessarily interested in watches, and to whom the term Swiss made doesn't really matter or mean anything. And I think this is because the Swiss watch industry simply hasn't tried to slot into this market, because they're trying to offer something which remains a superlative product. But I think in the process, this has meant that a lot of people who potentially in the future might have considered a mechanical watch instead place their money elsewhere. And if we look away from Switzerland and Germany as the European manufacturers of watches, one sees that the Far East, whether you look at China, Japan, Malaysia, Hong Kong, all of these areas are producing exceptionally good quality for affordable prices. If you want, say, a mechanical watch, if you do still want an affordable mechanical watch and you don't want to spend a larger sum of money, the quality coming out of these areas is at the moment fantastic. Now, in terms of information I've heard from trusted industry members and leaders, the quality coming out of the Far East, out of Hong Kong most specifically, is superior to what we see in Germany at the moment, for example. And this is for a number of reasons, but it means that this market for affordable mechanical watches, whether you look at Seiko from Japan, but also produced elsewhere in the Far East, or indeed a number of the smaller brands based in Hong Kong or China, are able to produce a product which is going to be more reliable and often better quality than the equivalent Swiss watch, because they're trying to stretch themselves into a price range in Switzerland which they're not really geared for. They're geared to produce much higher end watches. And you regularly hear, and I won't name anyone here, you regularly hear about quality control issues amongst sub-£1,000 Swiss brands and German brands. But the fact is that you don't hear the same thing from brands from the Far East, which has quite a lot to do with the approach. In Switzerland, they're trying to retrofit older movements, ETA movements, for example, to offer higher specifications at a lower price. And and pushing the movements beyond what they can do and pushing the build beyond what it can do really for the price. Whilst in the Far East they're doing the opposite. They're working to build up and see what they can get into the watches to increase the value. So perhaps it's not surprising that brands of this nature are doing so well, and this is why I'm a big supporter of, even if they use ETA movements, a lot of these brands from the Far East not necessarily going in for having Swiss made on the dial, even though they could, because their value in many cases is more than 60% Swiss. But I think that it's important to make the distinction. And so I don't think that the market for Swiss watches is going to move entirely up to the £2,500 mark and above. Certainly there's the most growth here, but I don't think this means that we won't be able to get hold of watches in general of a high mechanical or horological value. If you enjoy that kind of thing, if you enjoy a nice mechanical watch, or a nice quartz watch for that matter. And quartz certainly isn't going to die. It may die in Switzerland because of the fact that now they are trying to cater to a market which doesn't find it desirable. But with the likes of Citizen and Grand Seiko, quartz movements will certainly still have their niche. And of course it's plausible that Swiss watches will become more expensive, certainly they have, but perhaps the fact that the Swiss industry isn't trying to stretch itself across different price ranges means that we're going to get higher specifications and more interesting watches from Switzerland. Certainly Zenith and Omega are providing some incredible options at the moment at higher prices than they ever have before. But we are going to have to recognise that for affordable watches of a nice quality, other sources other than Europe may need to be considered. But I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say about this in the comments down below, whether you're listening to this on the watchchronicler.com website, on YouTube or elsewhere. So do leave your comments, do tell me what you think, because I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on this, this important and very current situation. So thank you very much for watching and listening, and remember to like, share and subscribe because it really does help the channel, and do read more and see more on watchchronicler.com. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand from watchchronicler.com, out.